Hey, everybody, welcome back to Typology, the podcast on which we explore the mystery of the human personality and the human adventure through the lens of the Enneagram. As always, I'm joined by my dear friend, Anthony Skinner. Anthony, greetings.
Woohoo! Hey, man, happy to be here. How you doing?
Man, I am doing well, and I'm doing particularly well because we have an old friend on the show today who I cannot wait to speak to about his new book. Please welcome Enneagram 3, Jonathan Merritt, back to the show. Jonathan.
Hello. Good to be back with you again. It's been a few years since I've been on Typology.
It has been 5 years.
5 years. That's more than a few. That's quite a few.
That's it. It's pre-pandemic. It is so many things. It's crazy. You have this wonderful new children's book by Gunkle and Me. I want to hear all about it. But first, I want to dive into some Enneagram 3 stuff with you. Can we do that?
Let's do it.
All right, I'm going to read you a quote that I love from Parker Palmer, who is, by the way, an Enneagram 3.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yes, Parker Palmer is an Enneagram 3, friends. You heard it here first. And he talks about his journey. And I don't know if he was thinking about the Enneagram when he wrote this, but this is what he said. Our deepest calling is to grow into our own authentic selfhood, whether or not it conforms to some image of who we ought to be. As we do so, we will not only find the joy that every human being seeks, we will also find our path of authentic service in the world. How does that land with you?
Well, I love that. I think as an Enneagram 3, and maybe this is a challenge. I mean, you're the expert more than I am, but I think one of the challenges I have is when I hear that phrase "authentic self," it feels so far away. It feels like something that I'm constantly out of touch with. Like I'm constantly asking myself, is this who I am, or is this the person that I'm trying to project to the world? And sometimes I actually don't know. So I think it connects with me because that's my constant challenge, is to live out my calling as my authentic self. But man, that's a real struggle for someone like me.
Yeah, you're so funny. One of the questions I wrote down, actually, it's the first question I wrote, is how do you tell when you are your own authentic self or when you're simply crafting an image for public consumption?
Yeah.
And of course, when we talk about Enneagram types, these are prototypes, right? So there's a part of me that does this, Anthony that does this, right? And there are the prototype of the 4, the 7, or the 9. Those are pieces of me as well. But I am curious because I'm always trying to, I think 3s ask all the time, like, well, how do I know, right? Like when I am flowing in the truth of myself and when I am merely projecting an image to win the admiration and the approval and the love of others. Does your body tell you? Is there something in you now at this age in your life where you're like, okay, I know I'm doing a shtick right now. Like I can feel the shtick.
Yes, that like anything, there's like the gray area in the middle where it gets really confusing. But then there are those like there are the poles, and I'll say that there are times where I'll laugh. And I'll catch myself going, that wasn't a real laugh, right? Or I can tell that I'm editing something in real time, right? Like I'm editing out all of the rough parts or the embarrassing parts. And so I catch myself. I mean, this is, in some ways, it's like the gift of the Enneagram is like a greater awareness. Like, it's not that I don't do the things, but now when I do the things, I'm aware that I'm doing it. And and I can kind of hold myself accountable and pivot away from those like affectations, those personality affectations. So I find that I am doing it maybe not as much as I used to, but I'm catching myself doing it a lot when I'm interacting with friends and family members and such.
So I have a woman I'm working with, and she's a very, very strong 3, and I'm completely masking this person's identity. But one of the things I've noticed in public settings is what I call the need to control the narrative. So it's as if in real time, in a group setting where this person is a leader, she wants to make sure that the narrative is crafted all the time. The conversation is just being crafted in the way that she wants things to be perceived and understood about herself and this situation. And it's almost like bending reality. It's like I'm watching this person burn incredible amounts of calories, trying to bend reality for everyone to see it a certain way. And I think that's a 3 struggle.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. And I'll tell you how, maybe this even goes back to the last question you asked. Sometimes the way that I know I'm doing the thing, the shtick, is after the encounter, after I've left the business meeting, after I've had the lunch with a friend, and I begin to kind of question whether or not they bought it, right? You begin to go like, did they perceive me the way that I wanted them to perceive me? And that sort of is the tell that you were doing the thing that 3s do so well. So a lot of times I'll pay attention to what I feel afterwards, and then I'll become obsessive. Where then let's say, for example, let's say that I'm in a business meeting and there are 3 of us and 2 of us walk away. I'll begin to ask that second person whether they thought I presented in this way in that meeting. And, you can see it on people's faces because maybe they're not a 3. So they're like, what are you talking? Why are we still talking about this? Why are we having a conversation about this? But I will want to kind of deconstruct the interaction to see like, hey, did I sound dumb when I said that thing? Or do you think that they thought that I was this way when I said that thing, right? So I will start to like deconstruct and tease apart the encounter, the meeting with the other person who was bearing witness to it. I do that all the time, and I think it drives my friends bonkers.
So it's almost like you're asking the question, did I pull it off?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, how does one break free of the addiction, really, right? And I say that not just about 3s, but of all types, right? We have addictive patterns like this, right? How does one break free of the need to control the narrative, to bend reality so that it shines on the right side of our face, our best side? How do we begin to let go of the need to impress?
Man, that's a good question. And you're probably the guru here, but I'll tell you something that's really been helpful for me and has been liberating for me is I talk about it as like reviewing the tape. So I go back and I look at all of the times when I wasn't able to control the narrative and it turned out okay. I was, I think maybe I talked about it 5 years ago when I was on this podcast before, but in 2012, I was very publicly outed for being gay. And I was not only was I not able to control the narrative in that situation, but I really mangled it. I responded, because I felt so judged, and I felt like I was failing in that moment so deeply that I began to panic, and I began to kind of express like stress behavior. I began to say things that I didn't believe were true, but I felt like people wanted to hear, even if they conflicted with other things that I was saying. And I was a total mess. And now I look back on that, some 12 years ago now, and I go, it's all okay. It all came out in the wash. Yes, you responded in a terrible way at times. Yes, you said things that were not a reflection of your authentic self, your authentic beliefs, and it was still okay. And so I think sometimes it's reminding ourselves of the pattern that many of us have in our lives when we weren't able to do the thing and we still survived and we still moved past it and we still moved through it. And so for me, reminding myself that there's a pattern there, that when I'm not able to control it, the stakes are not nearly as high as I assume, allows me to kind of allows my shoulders to come down from around my ears in the moment when I think that if I can't control this, then the worst possible thing, the thing that I fear the most, is what comes next.
So oftentimes I think what I've seen in 3s, and by the way, I have such a strong 3 wing, it's kooky, right? Like I'm a self-preservation 4, which already makes me a little 3-ish and 7-ish. But like I have a very, very strong 3 wing, right? So I'm resonating with everything that's being said. It seems to me that when you can't control the narrative, right, it's not working, right? It's just not working. That often what happens is we go into a tailspin, right? We start to helix down, right? And we find ourselves lost in the room of mirrors, right? Because if you've been playing all these games with different people for so long, right? Like, it's like you get sort of thrust into a panic mode, and you don't know which of your true selves is the true self to put out there. Right? Like, so you're kind of, it's like a vertigo like experience, right? It's like, oh, and also I'd say this, where 3s and 7s are different is in those situations, the 7 might reframe this. And I've said this before on the show, but it's worth saying, whereas the 3 will spin it. So the 7 might say, oh, this is a terrible experience, but, it's really going to help me grow with blah, blah, blah. So they, all of a sudden the negative becomes a positive, and they don't have to feel all the bad feelings, right, associated with betrayal or being outed publicly, humiliation, embarrassment, making mistakes, etc., right? Whereas the 3 will take a situation like that and spin it to make themselves look good. Do you know what I'm saying? Which is different. It's a nuanced. You're smiling a little bit for me. Is that?
Yeah.
So it's like, how do I spin this debacle to actually make myself look better than I did before it happened?
Yeah. Yeah. And I do this all the time. It's like the creative storytelling of the 3. And it's like that inner, I mean, as a 3, like I have a publicist that lives inside my brain. And so I'm always trying to tell stories about the choices that I've made, the way that things have worked out. And it kind of drives me crazy because now that I have a little bit of self-awareness, I'm like, I don't know what's real. Is that the story that I'm telling? Or is that really what happened, right? Did I make that decision and it worked out this way because that's the way it was supposed to have worked out and that was the health of the whole thing? Or is that like my post hoc rationalization of the situation so that I can like make peace with it and move on? And I don't know that I can answer that question sometimes.
Yep. Yeah, it's like if you, I met a 3 one time, and they had a very public failure, and the first word this person said, like maybe 2 or 3 days after it hit the headlines, right? The remark was something like, "Well, this is going to make a New York Times bestseller," and he had already begun thinking, "How can I turn this into a win?" Like into a win for me and for my public image and for my brand and my platform. And how can I turn, and that's spinning versus reframing. And I always love to make that delineation for people because sometimes it looks the same, but it's not, right? Because it's all around the image for the 3. So we're going to get to this wonderful children's book in just a moment, but I'm fascinated by this topic today. 2s, 3s, and 4s, the most image conscious numbers on the Enneagram, meaning they all project an image, believing they can't be loved for who they are. So in the case of 2s, but only for what they can do for others, for 4s, for being special and unique. And really for 3s, there's this need to really craft an image of winning and success, because for them, there's this belief that winning and success equals love somehow, like they want love and they settle for admiration, But one of the things that Beatrice Chestnut says that I find so interesting, she says for all 3 types, the common thread that runs through it is grief and shame. Or particularly grief and sadness, I should say. Others say shame, others say, feelings, like what at the heart center, what is the emotion that they share? And it's grief and sadness for 2s, 3s, and 4s, which you would not think for 2s and 3s, because 2s are so likable and upbeat and cheerful and, ebullient and, sometimes histrionic. And then you have 3s and they're confident and, blah, blah, blah. And, the appearance of having it all together. What role has grief and sadness played in your life?
Well, so much of of what you just said around not just grief and sadness, but you also use the word shame, I feel like plays a huge role in this, because for me, the publicist in me is aware that I'm doing it, and I feel sort of embarrassed about it. I don't say that out loud. I don't speak that part out loud, but I feel sort of ashamed. Particularly, this is the hard thing, the burden of learning a system like the Enneagram is now you're doing it. And so then you're sort of aware of your inauthenticities. And so I feel a lot of shame. I think the other thing is that, and this is where, at least for me, where grief comes into the equation, is that I realize not just the way I am, but I start to realize why I am the way that I am. And I begin to look back in my childhood, the demands that were placed on me when I was just a little boy. And I feel such a deep sense of sadness, because it's like now it sort of feels fixed, right? I can't escape who I am. So I have a constant reminder of these deep wounds from my childhood. And I'm constantly having to grieve that, because it's now that I see it everywhere, and I can't get away from it. And so I do feel like constantly grieved for that kid inside me who felt that he had to become who I am in order to survive, in order to be seen, in order to be loved. And I think anybody who becomes aware of that kind of pain that produces the personality feels a real sadness that hopefully you can allow it to mature into self-compassion, which is a little bit like softer form of grief. It's not just despair, right? So grief kind of falls off that cliff in one direction and it becomes despair. But if you allow it to kind of mature and blossom, it becomes self-love and self-compassion. I think in my best moments, that's what happens. I feel a deep sense of compassion for myself and for previous iterations of myself that had to endure all the pain they endured. But in my worst moments, I feel utter despair, because this is part of my story and it will never not be.
Yeah. So I think for me, as a 4 in the heart triad, I think I pretty successfully crossed the bridge from grief and despair to self-compassion and a sense of humor too. Like when I catch myself in the act of doing what I do, like my things, there is a little part of me that sort of smiles at myself the way a mother smiles at a child with his hand in the cookie jar. You know what I mean? like with a bit like, well, of course you are. You're 8 years old. Kids steal cookies at 8. And there's this kind of a smile, and I sort of giggle at myself a little bit, like busted. But it took a minute to get there. There was a long time on the grief and despair side of the bridge, for sure. And I do think that humor is like so important, like just having a sense of humor about our particular way of being in the world is like so freaking vital. But I want to hear, for people to be reminded of why, like what was the situation growing up and the pressures you felt, because it is a compelling story.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a fundamentalist home with a sort of famous religious leader. My dad is, to this day, a TV preacher. He was president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it was a very pietistic household, a very high pressure environment, an environment with a lot of anger and a lot of guilt. And and a lot of fear, a lot of anger, guilt, and fear. And those things were kind of the motivating factors for conformity in our house. And so when we were able to conform to what was expected of us and to do it really, really well, then we were rewarded, or at least we weren't punished, which was its kind of its own form of reward, is not being punished. Because if we all deserve punishment, not being punishment is the reward. So I grew up kind of in that pressure cooker. And, it wasn't until later on that I kind of assumed this is how everybody's house was, I went to college and I remember people saying, "Why do you yell all the time?" And I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And they're like, people don't yell like you yell all the time. And I realized, like, I grew up in this household that was so contentious that we were all having to get louder in order to be heard over everybody else. And I just thought this is how people talk. Or we would judge and eviscerate each other. And when I would start to do that to other people would be like, "You can't talk to me in that way." And I'd be like, "What do you mean? I'm just saying what I think is true." And people were like, "People don't talk to other people this way." So I had a real awakening, really in college, because I would learn the sort of normal human patterns of relationship, and then I would come home and I would be thrust back into this very different environment, and I realized I wasn't really able to tolerate it. So, it was a multi-year journey to kind of untangling what's normal, what's not normal. And then when I began to realize what I wanted for my life, kind of a more normal human way of relating to other people, then how would I go back and survive when I had to go home to be with my family, which is something that all of us do. And that was a multi-year journey, really, of having to sit down with my parents and my siblings and be like, "Guys, not only is this not normal, maybe it is, sometimes it is normal, sadly, but it's not healthy and it's not good. And we have to find a different way of relating to each other." And, I was lucky enough that I had a family for the most part over time that was willing to go on that journey with me.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp.
Hey, Anthony, we all deal with our stressors in different ways, right?
Sure.
Whether they're big or small, when we keep them bottled up, it can negatively affect our mental health and our relationships.
Oh, absolutely. For me, for instance, if I'm in a stressor situation, I can find myself waking up at like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, just pondering, mulling over what's been going on.
Yeah, man, I hear you. Me too. So when I start feeling weighed down, it is really important for me to pause and identify my stressors. Then once I label my triggers, I can then work to bring things back into balance. But for some people, recognizing what is going on underneath the surface can be really difficult. That's where therapy comes in. A good therapist provides a safe place to not only figure out what's weighing you down, but how to work through it so you can be the best version of you. And with BetterHelp's online therapy, you don't have the added pressure of squeezing in a trip to the therapist's office. It's entirely online and designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. So if you've got something you're struggling with, I encourage you to get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/Typology podcast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Typology podcast. So you're the son of a famous religious figure, public figure. You're a gay young man, let's say, or I'm not sure at what point in your life's journey all the dots connected for you in terms of coming to terms with your own sexual identity. Where is it now? Like how have you, there's so many things I want to ask you about. Like, okay, so making peace with family. I mean, you have a brand new book out, My Gunkle and Me, about this young boy, Henry Higgleston, who's kind of viewed as an oddball by the other kids at school, and his wonderful gay uncle arrives for a weekend with his French bulldog in tow, and he's on a mission to teach Henry that that what makes us different makes us special. Okay, so you are a gay man in the public sphere. You are a public figure. Like, how is this reconciled with family?
Well, in some ways, my siblings and their kind of growing embrace transformed me. because they were like, we love you. You don't have to be something in order to be loved by us. We love you. And, they began to have kids, and those kids, as kids do, they loved me. And they loved me because of who I was, not because of which box I checked under sexual orientation, let's say. I think that my whole imagination for what family could be and what it meant to live and love within the confines of family really expanded a few years ago in New York City, because I moved into an old seminary property here in Manhattan in Chelsea. And I began to live alongside a number of families. In fact, it was shortly after, or right around the time, I guess, that I was on your show last in probably 2019. I just moved in here. And these families invited me in, and they said, you have a seat at our table. And this seat is not just like any other seat. It is an honored and a celebrated seat. And we recognize that you have gifts to give that we cannot give. And our family will be poorer if you're not giving those gifts to us. And, for somebody like me who grew up in a culture that said that gay people were threatening to families, both the lowercase f family that lives next door and the kids that exist in those households, and also the big capital F family, the traditional family, I didn't realize how ingrained that assumption had been sort of made in my own spirit, that I had really ingested that idea and even had accepted that, I couldn't be around families and kids like this. And so it was their love for me and their embrace of me that really changed me. And it really alerted me to all of the ways that I had come to believe things about myself that were not true. And so it's been actually living here that I think accelerated that process. So when I ended up deciding that I wanted to write a children's book, a friend of mine who lives here said, why don't you just write about what you know and write about how you've been living alongside us and the ways that you have touched our families. And so this book is kind of a composite, both of my biological nephews and nieces back home, and also it incorporates all of these stories of the ways that I have been living here in the seminary.
So what would it have been like for you to have had a book like My Gunkle and Me when you were 7 or 8 years old?
This is sort of the crazy thing, because, and I think a lot of children's authors say this, or they do this. They write the book that they wish they would have had when they were a child. And in some ways, I guess I really did that. I'm well aware that the kind of grown-up that a person becomes is largely a result of the types of stories that the grown-ups in their life chose to tell them when they were children. And we can all point back to the stories that we were told for good or ill, and they weren't always written down on pages. They were the stories our families told. They were the mythologies that we were given in our families, the kinds of stories we were told and the assumptions underneath those stories, and the films we watched and the TV shows that we watched. And we ingested those and we digested those, and they became sort of embedded in our DNA. And we've lived into those assumptions, in many cases unaware, in adulthood. And I wish I had had better stories. I wish I had had stories that said, you are loved because of who you are, and God loves you because of who you are, and God made you the way you are, and that the ways in which you are different from the majority of people in this world, those differences are not liabilities. They're your gifts to the world. They're the things that make you you. I think in some ways when people see this book, they go, you're the Gunkle, right? I can even kind of look like the way that the illustrator, the great illustrator, the way that this illustrator rendered me. And it wasn't actually until this book was published that I realized I'm also Henry. And what I think I did, maybe even on an unconscious level, was the future self, or I guess at this point, the present me, almost went back in time to take a knee and to look the past me in the eyes and to say the things that needed to be said to me that were never said. And I think that's ultimately what happens in this book.
Everybody, I'm speaking with our friend Jonathan Merritt, the author of the new children's book, My Gunkle and Me. Jonathan, what is it right now that is the frontier of growth for you? Like, it could be what you're dealing with in therapy, or just like it's just a theme that's coming up over and over again in your life right now that you're like, I'm working on X.
Oh, this is a good one because, and I can tell you, I might not have been able to tell you a year ago, but I began this like journaling practice starting last summer. And it started by doing the artist way, which I'm sure a lot of people know, where you do morning pages, you sort of write stream of consciousness in the morning. And for me, it's become, I think, a more intentional journaling practice meets prayer practice even. And I've been able to kind of track some things going on. And I think one of the things I've realized is the ways in which fear motivates so much of my life. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of insignificance, fear of irrelevance. You know, I mean, I'm all the time afraid of how people perceive me. I mean, even when I wrote this book, I was like, you can't write a children's book. First of all, you won't be able to do it well, and it'll be a big mess, and that'll embarrass you. And if you go out and do it, and if you do get it published, then people will think that you're unserious. You're supposed to be this columnist. You write for the New York Times. You write for the Atlantic. You write serious grown-up books with data and arguments and persuasion inside of them. You can't write a children's book. It's silly. It's unserious. And I'm realizing all of the things that I feel called to do and compelled to do that I am held back from doing because fear has grown in my life at such a level that's really what I feel like I need to. It's like the number one task of my life right now is digging down deep and trying to kind of chip away at the root of fear that is so deeply ingrained in my life. You know, even a minute ago, you were talking about the ways in which Enneagram 3s are trying to kind of control the narrative. And I have these like twin responses. I'm both trying to control the narrative and I'm telling myself I'm not doing it. I'm failing at it. And so I feel like everybody else, I'm trying to do it, and I feel like everybody else must see that I'm trying to do it. And then I feel embarrassed and ashamed that the jig is up, that everybody knows what's going on. And so I'm both trying to do something that I'm convinced I'm going to fail at. And there's a real misery to living stuck in that cycle. And so I think that's the one thing that I'm really working on right now. The one thing that I hear over and over and over, or I have been hearing over the last year when I'm having this kind of moment of prayer or meditation in the morning is, you know, I hear God or the universe, whatever you want to call it, saying back to me, trust and let go. Trust and let go. You cannot control. And you know, the thing that keeps me stuck as a 3 is trying to control what I cannot control. It's, you know, it's like an exercise in frustration and failure, trying to control the thing I can't control. And so I think the task for me right now is recognizing the fear that's driving that impulse and then learning to let it go.
I love what you just said. The fear of not being able to control what I can't control. And I love what you said about trust and letting go. You know, in my 12-step program, we do a lot of work with what's called a fear inventory, where we actually do as part of our fourth and fifth steps, right? You have to actually write a fear inventory, like to write down everything you're afraid of. And one of the, you know, amazing gifts of that program is, like, I had no idea the degree to which fear governed my life. I had no idea until I sat down and really started to write stuff out. And I was like, oh my gosh, fear dictates so much of my thinking and my feeling and my way of behaving. It's ridiculous, right? And so we go through this process, and I think the Enneagram helps us. Things like the 12 steps help us, different tools that, that we can avail ourselves of, help us to uncover, discover, and discard those parts of ourselves that are no longer serving us. And you've done a beautiful job of just articulating, I think, you were talking about the fear of irrelevance, the fear of insignificance, the fear of worthlessness. And of course, what can we control? And realizing there are so many things I get anxious about over which I have no control, in which the only solution is surrender and trust. Just perpetually reminding myself, surrender and trust. Thank you for that. Jonathan Merritt, author of My Gunkle and Me, this marvelous new children's book. I love what Kate Bowler said about it. Every parent needs this, a story of love that teaches children that they are never, ever alone. We all need a Gunkle. And I'm glad I had a Gunkle today, Anthony, and he was on our show. And Jonathan, thanks for being on, my friend.
Oh my gosh, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you again.
And Anthony.
Yes, sir.
May you and everyone listening have love. May you have joy. May you have peace. May you have healing. And may you have rest. Until next time.